live. Welcome to another episode of Unscripted, and I have the great pleasure to introduce Deborah Snyder. Thank you very much for joining me. How are you?
Thanks for having me, David.
We had this scheduled quite a few times, and you're very busy professional. I wanted to first and foremost thank you for taking the time to chat with me today, and for all those who are watching, we haven't had any chance to plan because we're both super busy, so it's going to be mostly unscripted and authentic conversations. So thank you very much for joining me, Deb.
All good. Thank you for having me.
So why don't we get started with kind of the easy questions? How did you get started in cyber?
Oh, gosh. Well, somewhat, it's an interesting story because it was somewhat accidental. All right. So what I mean by that is I'd have to say I just sort of fell into the CISO role at a time when information security was just starting to form as a professional field. I was working for one of the state's largest human services agencies, directing program modernization efforts and initiatives. I had just wrapped up a rather lengthy and exhaustingly complex initiative. And our commissioner had a meeting with me to debrief. And he, during that meeting, shared a memo from the state CISO, or CIO, excuse me, that directed each agency to appoint a CISO. No one even really knew what that involved. Most thought it was a technical role. So the commissioner asked me to research and come up with a job description and duties, and then he promptly left on vacation for a week and a half. When he came back, I presented my summary, having done some research and reached out to folks who were working in the role in private sector at the time. Of course, I was from the government sector, and I better understood what the role entailed. So I presented my summary to him, and I expressed that it was fundamentally about managing risk to the organization's information assets, data systems, infrastructure, and so on. And then my hand did this thing that it used to do back in the day. I have this trick elbow. So I presented my summary and I expressed a keen interest. I said, I'd like to explore taking on this role. And he said, it's yours. So that was that. Of course, then, the deer in the headlights look took over, and I had to very quickly shift from program direction to cybersecurity and figure out what that meant. So a lot of reliance on good industry professionals and mentors, some keen investments in certification and getting myself worthy of the role. And then we started the hard work of building from the ground up the state's first information security program at an agency level. I was the first appointed agency CISO in the state, and I served in that role for several years before, almost a decade before I moved on to serve as the state's deputy CISO and subsequently as the state's chief information security officer and member of the executive team. Of course, my background in the business side of the government services delivery system versus the tech side uniquely positioned me to better understand the critical assets that support government services, the risks to them, and to ensure that our program efforts aligned with the administration's mission, goals, and objectives.
What an incredible story, and you managed to glance over so many things. I have to just open up and ask you a couple more questions. So sounds like there was a lot of on-the-job training, at least from you.
Yeah, it certainly was, right? So, I mean, we all figure out how to do the job we're taking on. Let's not kid ourselves. No one ever knows how to do the job you're taking on, right? So with that in mind, and with the deer in the headlights look dispatched, I started talking to people. Okay, how do you run your program? What does it look like? What are the foundational components? Of course, that was before all the goodness of these frameworks that we now can leverage. But we had to figure it out. So between myself and the CIO, and I worked out of the Division of Legal Affairs. So in terms of my positioning in the organization, reported directly through legal up to the commissioner, which was a rather unique reporting environment back in that time. Most of the CISOs reported into the CIO, which I think creates a little bit of friction, right? So the objectives of the CIO are different, operational, if you will, and not as risk-based in terms of strategic thinking. But I had a pretty good background in risk management, project management, in the ability to influence, a fairly solid set of soft skills, relationship management, the ability to, talk people into doing the right things, I guess. And then the technical training and the logistical training in terms of programmatic aspects and functions of of performing those duties. I had to gain through SANS courses, certifications, going back to school, if you will, and really growing. So it's
And
fun.
yeah, but it sounds like also that you went out of your comfort zone because you were doing something fairly different. And do you remember what was attractive to you to take ownership on something that was a bit of an unknown, if not all
Yeah,
of an
I
unknown?
do. I do. I mean, back in the day and even now, I do tend to be a person that likes building something new, right? And once it's built, I tend to get bored with it and move on to the next initiative. I guess it's just my personality. I am motivated by a little bit of the innovation factor or engagement in what's new and needs to be put in place. So yeah, it was entertaining and interesting to me from that perspective. And it's a different job every day. And it's primarily about problem solving, right? And risk management, which I was uniquely positioned to understand. At the same time, enabling the business to go where they want to go. So I used to, when I was talking to my teams, I would always say, look, our job isn't to say no or to get in the way. Our job is to be the wind beneath the wings of the organization and say, how do we get there from here securely? So when they'd come up with a grand idea like delivering services from the corner bodega in New York City, I would say, gee, that's a really neat idea. And here's how we do it through the protocol of putting laptops into the hands of our field workers that are secured by us versus using the ubiquitous wireless on the street corner in New York City at the bodega, right? So you just have to figure out the way over, under, through, or whatever the controls that are necessary to achieve the objective, and of course, at the same time, protect assets and achieve your compliance goals.
In governments and government structures are not typically, at least from the point of view of the common knowledge and people in the civilian, like the citizens side of the house, they don't necessarily always seem to be the most innovative, the most forthcoming structures. So, do you remember why the government decided to all of a sudden, look into creating such a structure and such as security controls in place? What was there any particular triggers?
Do I remember why? Well, mostly at the time, in that day and age, it was compliance driven, right? The regulations were what was the main driving force underneath it. But to manage your program from a compliance-based perspective is flawed from the get-go. Compliance doesn't get you good security. Good security will get you a long ways towards compliance. So frankly, stepping back from that and saying this really is about making sure our organization can do what they want to do, innovate where they want to, go where they want to go, if you will, and at the same time protect assets and ensure compliance. That kind of more well-rounded, holistic view from a business side of the equation helped me a great deal. Of course, I was in contretemps with all the other state CISO agency CISOs that came out of the technical field. Hate to say it, all props and recognition for technical skilled folks, and we need them keenly in our business environments. But I often had very interesting discussions related to, no, we got to lock it down, and we have to, these are the controls we need to have in place. Here's the standard that we need to follow. Well, what's the spirit of those standards? Managing risk to assets. So those pivotal discussions were interesting from my perspective. Mostly I prevailed.
And how do you know where to get started? Because all of a sudden this thing fell into your lap, and there are just so many avenues you could have taken. And also, I'm assuming that you wanted the first 60 to 90 days to prove that you were the right choice for the job.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, those first 90 days, you got to have a plan, right? And no matter what job you're assuming. So I think where I started, and I got to search my memory banks a little bit on that one, but it's a great question to kind of wake up those memories. Where I started was looking to leading organizations and what they were doing. Because at the time, again, those frameworks, although the ISO 27000 framework was in existence, more so government organizations are driven by NIST standards. So I very quickly said, okay, let me sort out what the conversation is going to look like when the federal agencies that oversee our state programs come to town. either in an audit conversation, which is always fun, or from a perspective of program enhancements. So let me sort out what those conversations are going to look like, and very quickly figured out that they were going to speak the language of NIST standards. So I began to lean into and adopt those and use those as my yardstick in the absence of any other formal programmatic ability to evaluate where we were. And then just started with the high value assets in our organization. I mean, you don't protect your gold with the same standard that you protect, say, lesser entities. So I said, all right, what's functionally important to our organization from a perspective of doing business? What systems, what data sets, what people, what infrastructure do we rely upon to get the job done, to achieve our mission? And sorted that top tier out in terms of where we started, and we started hammering down whether we had the appropriate controls to align with the standards and to meet regulatory requirements. So again, it was rather regulatorily driven at the time, being that we're a heavily audited and also a heavily litigated organization. But we started with that. And then, of course, the formal NYS cybersecurity framework came out. I was fortunate to be involved in commenting and helping shape that. So when it came out in 2014, I was serving as the deputy CISO at the time. We were already adopting it. We were already engaged in making sure we could use it, again, as our yardstick for both evaluating and also selecting initiatives and prioritizing efforts that helped us move further along the maturity curve to where we wanted to be in our program.
It sounds like, just listening to you, it sounds like you were very intuitive in terms of, because I've talked to a lot of CISOs, and the first thing they say, well, I had to figure out what are the crown jewels. And then, how do I go about protecting those, and how do I basically, what you mentioned, enable the business to do what they need to do? And that's my first priority as a CISO, and do all of that. And that was before there were, but I think today they have it easy because they have the frameworks, as you mentioned. But when you joined, there was a lot of it was you had to pave the way and figure things out on your own. So,
well, back in the day, that's absolutely true. But again, my background from the business side of government, I started in the trenches with the counties, and then moved to the state to, as a young professional, change the world, right? And wrote legislation for many a year that changed the programs that the state articulates and delivers. And then from there, moved into oversight on critical digital modernization projects. So it was kind of a progressive growth spectrum for me that positioned me, I think, uniquely to be able to span that translation from services to technology and back again.
And I'm sure it wasn't an easy path. Again, you were successful, but success is always paved with, success and some failures that you hopefully learn from and grow. Can you share, without providing too many details, maybe, if there were some memorable stories from your tenure?
Oh my goodness, trying to bite off too big a chunk, right? So I remember trying to entertain the notion of doing data classification as a project, i.e., an agency-wide project, and then subsequently a statewide project.
I think Deb, at this point we have to pause for 10 seconds to let it sink in what you just said.
Well, I definitely had to take a pause because I was all full of the passion of getting it done, right? And I had this whole project of, how we were going to get it done. And people just went, we're not required to do that. We're over here trying to get business done, and so on and so forth. So I had to pick and entertain a smaller complement, if you will, of scope, and just take it piece by piece and build on that momentum and provide some structure, while at the same time inviting kind of the motivation to have its own momentum, to develop its own momentum. But I stepped back from that about a year into the project. Even slowing the roll, I had to step back from it and say, okay, we're not getting this done. How do we get it done quicker? And so I stepped back, and we came up with a retooling that essentially reclassified or classified data and said, wherever that data lives, this is the classification for it. We didn't go system to system to system, data set to data set to data set. We just said, for these types of records, this type of data, wherever it lives, whoever uses it, this is the classification. And so therefore, this is the baseline set of controls. From there, you can go up if you want to put additional rigor in place, but you cannot go down. So that was the strategy that we took. It was a hard lesson, though. I got more than my share of dings from that one.
And it's amazing that you were able to, it takes a certain level of being humble and to know that you've made the wrong choice and you have to step back and not push for it. I think it's just as important to know where you're successful as to know where you've made the wrong decision and know how to step back from it and take ownership over that.
I've always been a keen believer in being strategic minded. If what you are doing is not working, why are you continuing to spend time and dime doing it, right? So my strategy was, look, we'll try this, we'll see how it goes. And if after 6 months or 2 months or 2 weeks, whatever, there is a resounding indication that it's not working, then it's time for us to go back to the drawing board, or the whiteboard, as it was in many cases in my office, which was always cluttered with ideas and recircuiting, if you will, of the strategies. I mean, you have to figure out what suits your business. And for cyber, I think it's not a one size fits all approach, right? There are certain things, commonalities that have to come with a complement of a good cybersecurity program, certain foundational functions, capabilities, capacities. But I think you need to really think about the big picture and what suits your organization. It's not just set and forget it either, right? It's changing, it's dynamic, which is what I love about it. It's a different job every day. So when I talk to, I teach at graduate school level, and when I talk to my students and encourage them to enter into this crazy career, I'm often one to say, look, you got to be up for challenge. You got to be up for the kind of the different way of thinking. You've got to be able to motivate people, and you've got to be able to think strategically. Step back, pick your head up off the operational page every single day and ask what's working, what do we keep doing, what's not working, and how do we fix that?
And I think we need more of that. I think, especially in cybersecurity, I think we're less strategic. We're very tactical. It's all about the vulnerabilities, the exploits, we're always in the kind of down in the weeds, and even the vendors themselves are always down in the weeds, and they're not looking to solve like the bigger problems, like this, the strategic problem, like where the organization's doing. Because again, from a government perspective as well, things have to be planned way in advance, right? It's budgets. It's like a very large, cruise ship where you cannot turn on a dime.
And frankly, governments are always resource constrained. So how do you get the best value? And I thought it was, it's your fiscal responsibility to be accountable for the funding and the resources, the people, the time and money that the state is spending towards that objective. Just like any other initiative, somebody's going to hold you accountable at some point. So you might as well start holding yourself accountable. So when our team first started this interesting journey, the first thing we did was we figured out what the budget cycles were, and figured out how we got on board that. How far back do we need to start our planning for our strategic plan for this year, for our near-term, short-term plan, and our longer-term strategic plan? What does that look like? So from the get-go, I tended to be fairly keen in terms of assuring that our strategic plans had good alignment, that we were not far off, if you will, and course corrections weren't painful.
And from resource constraint, how would you quantify where, especially when we're talking about such large budgets, where to spend your money to make sure that you have the best bang for the buck to reduce the risk? Because as a mandate as a CISO, you were mandated to reduce the risk as much as possible, but we had resource constraints. How did you decide where to spend that money, and you mentioned in an accountable way, to make sure that you create an impact? And again, do that for, everything is such a fast moving target. And it's almost like, be able to foresee where things are going and, skate to where the puck is, not where the puck is right now.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. So it depends on where you are, right? I mean, where you're starting as an organization. So, once you do that initial flyover at the 50,000 feet and figure out where you are, I think that it's incumbent upon you to think about what makes the most sense to get that return on your investment. So for the state, I mean, we went through in 2012 at the direction of the governor, we went through a centralization of IT services and resources. And despite some of the consternation that I had about being pulled into the organization that was created, I was rather outspoken about it, which is probably what earned me the invitation to help make it happen, right? But despite my consternation about putting cybersecurity under IT, if you will, and the only time I would recommend that as an organizational structure is when you do centralize your IT resources and it still has accountability and reporting to the governor's office, right, through an executive deputy, as it were. So they created this independent agency, or this consolidated agency, and they took all of the IT resources and services, including security services, which was at the time perceived as an IT function. We both have grown from there, I'm sure, but they consolidated it. So I was invited to help them consolidate and figure out how to run that bit of the state's business. And it was interesting because we were able to do a few things: pool resources, take the skill sets that we had, and at least have them centralized and be able to use them where they were most necessary for the highest risk agencies and so on. But it also led to a very swift conclusion that we had a myriad of inconsistencies across agencies. So we were able to centralize policy. That was one of our first investments. We were able to centralize and consolidate and rationalize some of the tools, be able to upgrade some of the tools. Boy, you were right on point when you said the state might be a click or two behind, not just New York State, but any state and local government.
I was being very polite about this.
At the time, I wouldn't say that they're still in that position. In fact, I would say that they've come a long way. But one of the first investments we made was in rationalizing and consolidating, making the assessment of where our skill sets were, where we needed to invest in our people. Boy, am I passionate about that. We built a training program such that every single one of our folks were certified in the area that they were performing the functions. So if they were working in my cyber command team, they were certified in pen testing and incident response and cyber SOC analysis and so on. If they were working in risk management, they were certified in compliance and risk strategies and so on and so forth. So we really invested some resources in training. That was one of the first initiatives. Policy considerations. I'm trying to think what else we invested in. Identity management, multi-factor authentication, some technical things, email filtering and so on. We tried to close the gaps where they were. We looked at what, again, leading organizations were doing, what the standards were telling us were best of breed practices. We looked at what we had, where our gaps were, and then we just prioritized those and started knocking them off as budget would allow. Building the business case to present to budget so that we would be able to defend our request for those monies, and then building in, and this is so important, building in performance metrics that proved that what we did actually had the results that we intended, provided value for the state and for the organizations.
And again, listening the way you talk about these large scale projects, there's just so many moving parts, and part of the things that you had to deal with, especially at your level, you have to get buy-in from the different business groups and in the organization, and there's a lot of resistance to change. And you as a senior leader, you have to be a bit of a politician. You got to have to kind of go out and explain and get and it's hard because you're as a security professional, you had to learn it and you had the aptitude to do that. But a lot of times, I'm sure the concept and things you were trying to explain were very foreign to other people in the organization. So how did you manage to do that? What was your kind of modus operandi when you were trying to deal and get buy-in with these large-scale projects?
Well, again, fortunately, I came out of the business, right? So I didn't tend to speak technologies.
And I think, Deb, you also had a clout, right? Because of that, right? That
Right.
people saw you.
I had the
Right.
reputational influencing factor, right? So the authority, if you will, was there when I was a state CISO, to be sure. But I also had spent my time in the trenches, and I could speak the language of the business. And so you have to come at it with the what's in it for me factor first and foremost in order to convince folks to get on board. People want to do the right things. Right? They don't want to be the subject of the latest news story. They don't want to be in the paper. They don't want their organization to be seen as deficient in security practices and so on. So they want to do the right things. They just need to understand what you are trying to tell them. And using examples of the pain that, say, the city of Baltimore or the Louisiana education system went through, or Florida, the state of Florida went through, and so on and so forth, using someone else's breach or compromise to tell the story. People remember stories. We remember stories, right? That's how we get our points across. And so if you can make that pivot from, hey, this can happen, and our practices are no better or worse than where this recently occurred, so this could happen to us, and these are the steps we need to take, and the accountability factor. This is what I need from you to fix the problem or to advance the needle, if you will. They want to know what you want them to do. And if you can't come to the table and tell that story with the emphasis on the pivot point that is, okay, I brought the risk into the room, you've been briefed, you now know what I know, you now understand what I understand, and this is what we need to do about it. You've shared the accountability. Once risk enters the room, accountability follows. If you can tell that story in that context and get that across, and then ask them as the advocate, as the leadership of the state or the local or the organization, whatever entity you're serving, then you've made them accountable. I used to say firmly, look, my job is to give you good counsel. Hopefully you'll take it, understanding what I've said. If you have any questions, we'll discuss it further. But at the end of the day, the business unit has to make the decision as to what we do about this risk. You own it. You have to make the decision as to whether we ride with it or whether we try to mitigate it in some fashion. And generally speaking, that's enough, right? That's enough emphasis to punctuate the point.
And how did you, in the private sector, typically the way you start moving projects along, you set up a meeting, then maybe a series of meetings, and then there's a kind of almost like a project, timelines, and then there's typically an end date with some sort of success criteria, and so on. Is that also true in the public sector? Like, how did you know that you were on track? And again, because it's just such a large project, how would you know that you are on the path to be successful and not come back after 12, 18 months saying, oh my God, we're so behind, it's not working?
Yeah, so we had in New York State, we had a project management office, right? So all projects, including security initiatives, had to go through that, had to be vetted. If they were above a certain financial investment level, they had to go through, additional vetting at the executive and at the Department of Budget level to get funded to begin with. So by the time they got to deployment, implementation, planning, and so on, they were already pretty well vetted. The business case was solid. The solutions were well articulated, generally speaking. And I never went into any of our security projects without some key KPIs and KRIs, key risk indicators and key performance indicators that we would use and leverage during the execution to determine whether or not we were achieving our goals. So beyond good project management protocols to keep things moving and to have good reporting mechanisms and to make sure that you weren't, driving scope beyond what was anticipated or cost beyond what you were funded for, really measuring your results, measuring outcomes, being outcome focused from the get-go, being able to say, look, we want to put in email filtering, for example. We want to put enhanced email filtering in so that we reduce the risk of bad email coming into our users' mailboxes and reduce the risk of somebody clicking on something, well-formed phishing email, for instance. So right now we have this many incidents that are email-based as a vector. We want to reduce that by X number. And here's what we think we need to do about it. And then measuring before as a baseline and after as a baseline, and being able to emphatically say, after we implemented enhanced email filtering, we reduced the amount of spam and potential phishing email campaigns by 85 to 90%, thus reducing the risk to the organization. I like to be able to stand on really sound ground, right? When I'm defending a project, or when I'm shouting from the hills, about the successes of the security program and the value that it brings to the organization. So we never went into it without some sense of how we were going to measure success, what success would look like.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's kind of a struggle for a lot of organizations, just in general. So I think the complexity of security projects make it even more difficult. And I also find, the pace of change, just in general, is becoming such that by the time you're trying to solve something, you have to solve the next big thing. It seems like the window of opportunity to close some of these gaps from a security perspective. I always take the analogy of we're on the highway doing 60, 70 miles an hour, trying to figure out why we should have seatbelts. And I think it was like that for the longest time. Cars were already doing 50, 60 miles an hour before they decided to put seatbelts on. And I think that's in a digital economy, we're moving so fast, and you can probably back me up on this. We're moving so fast, and everybody wants the ease of use of getting to the data wherever, as you mentioned, in the local bodega, not thinking, okay, what are the implications of having all that data there? And maybe you can chime in on that. And how did you solve that in such a large scale?
It's funny that you mentioned the, kind of like the car seatbelts, brakes analogy, because I made me think of a situation where my CTO, who is a really innovative person, was saying how he's going to build the red Ferrari that went zoom for government. And I'm like, and I'm going to be chasing after you, throwing seatbelts and brakes at it. Right? So how do you build that in? A couple of different ways. One is the cultural change, right? The dynamics of building security and cyber savvy thinking into the culture of your organization. And that's not easily done, but you do it one person at a time, one team at a time, one initiative at a time. The next thing I think you need to think about is, how do you build security into your project management, your initiatives, your the flow, the process workflow, to make sure it's thought of upfront. The moment somebody gets that grand idea of the new that they want to do, you start asking the questions about, okay, what regulatory drivers are you subject to? What data will be involved? What systems are you going to use? Who is going to be the user? Is it going to be internal, external facing? You start asking all of those questions so that the requirements start to bubble up rather early, and so that they get used to you being at the table, asking the questions, not inviting you at the last minute before the production version is about to cross the finish line and saying, sprinkle some security dust over this so that we're good, right? So you get your team involved early, you architect and design with security in mind from the get-go, clean requirements, clean specifications, right? I would often argue, well, we want to make sure that this product is a quality product, right? Whatever the product or services we were building. So to you and to I, would you agree that a quality product is a secure product? It doesn't end up with the state in the paper. It doesn't end up with our sensitive data on the streets. And no one can answer no to that, right? Everybody has to shake their head yes. So that is somewhat of the kind of the foundation that you have to lay, that cultural change where everybody's responsible for thinking about it. You've achieved it when you're at a project meeting and they are asking the questions about cyber. Have we thought about cyber? It's not your team, it's them. And then you're like, oh, okay, I can step back from this one and I can pivot and go on to the next team, which was rather nice to see that happen over time. Of course, nothing like that happens instantly. You can mandate certain things through standards and process. The more you can automate it, the more you can make it consistent, the better. Building it into your secure system to life cycle, thinking about it in procurement, because we all buy or procure services in some fashion, right? Every organization, especially today, is probably a hybrid situation where they have some things they build and some things they buy. but making sure that you have consideration of security and procurement, that you're vetting your products and services and vendors and service providers in a professional and sound way is also important. And then last but not least, it's never one and done, right? So that continuous cycle of making sure you know where you are, where your utmost risk focus needs to be, and that you're constantly keeping your fingers on the dial. One of the biggest investments that organizations are making today, beyond identity management and the types of things that are just standard rigor, is visibility. Being able to see across your infrastructure, across your environment, across your business environment, and being able to be more proactive about detecting the anomalous before it becomes the problem, right? So I think those types of things have helped a lot.
And we've seen recently that there are, if you look at the kinetic conflict between Ukraine and Russia, there are fears of critical infrastructure being targeted by nation state, and it looks like this was kind of the first time where kinetic conflict was followed by or in conjunction with cybersecurity attacks. There is even greater responsibility now for the local and state government to protect the critical infrastructure, but yet there's a lot of gaps there, as you mentioned. One, which is the visibility. We don't know what we don't know. A lot of these SCADA systems are not, fairly archaic, just due to the fact that when they were deployed to initially, the system did not exist. How do we, again, coming from your perspective, how do we solve that and become more resilient as a nation at the state and government level?
I think the administration has made some really important and critical steps with the executive order and the missives that have directed federal government to up their game, right? So it's not optional anymore. It's not, hey, here are some standards, follow them if you will, but it's a firm mandate. I think when FISMA came about early on, it was something that had some momentum behind it, but not enough stick, if you will. So I think that the executive order has focused in the right areas. It's focused on supply chain concerns. It's focused on critical infrastructure. Of course, critical infrastructure protection has been a focus for a decade and a half, 2 decades now. But I think this time around, I'm encouraged that there's enough strength behind it as well as funding. So, pause there and take that in. How can we can do a lot with a little, but you can't do anything with nothing. Right? You can't really move the needle. And for a lot of years, there was insufficient investment in financial sense and resource sense. I think they've also upped the game in terms of training and skill sets and the rigor behind the profession. And so competing, as you might expect in a world where there is a scarcity of cybersecurity skills is difficult for government organizations, and it's no less difficult at the national level. But I think that the combination of the policy changes, the funding underneath that, and the commitment to be more attentive, as well as the threat, right? This global threat scenario has certainly ripened and caused a focus that wasn't there before. I don't think this is the first time. I don't think Ukraine is the first time we've had this admission that cyber warfare is real and can be used. I think the attack on the tanker back in 2019 with the Iranian intervention, I think that was probably the wake-up call. And before that, some attacks on the grid of other foreign countries by non-friendlies. Those were certainly, something to think about, and I think got our nation's attention. But yeah, I mean, it's there. Critical infrastructure, the shutting down of any of our lifeline critical infrastructures, whether that be communications or government services, which I would have to say that government sometimes forgets they are CI. They are critical infrastructure.
Oh, of course.
But without government services, and we saw that during COVID, when government services had to kind of step back and say, whoa, how do we get this done without facilities, right? Without government services, things quickly deteriorate. It's certainly a big cog in the wheel.
Very much so. And quite a few times during this conversation, you mentioned that the cybersecurity is a team sport, and you're very big into training and supporting your staff, supporting people into becoming more proficient in their role as part of your overall risk management, right? So you see that as like, as if your employees and people, your team members and others are more proficient and the organization itself is more secure, how does the government train and also attract talent? Because sometimes you can't afford the top talent, and they potentially can come in, get trained, and move somewhere else. I just heard somewhere that some of the tech companies that laid off employees recently, the government is, specifically are trying to attract them to come over to work for them, especially in the Silicon Valley area. So how do you do that? It's a fine balance between getting the right talent with the budget you have, and then making sure that everybody's happy and stay put. And you've done remarkably well for yourself in the public sector, and there's a lot of merit to it. As you mentioned, you managed to grow professionally inside the organization and done really well. But not everybody is clear that this is something you can do. Some people see the government as being, oh, I'm going to get there, get a government job, and it will take me nowhere. But you are obviously the poster child of things potentially being very different.
Yeah, we had so it's multi-pronged, right?
Yes.
It's not just one thing you do; it's multiple things that you do, starting with outreach to universities and even K through 12 programs. So we had a very rigorous training and awareness team that not only was focused on training internally, but also had the state mission of training the public, and in addition, training agency staff who performed other functions statewide, but had to at least have some cyber knowledge and awareness to perform those government program delivery functions. So all three of those focuses made sense to bring together, kind of raising everyone's awareness of cyber. In addition, we had a skills-based training program that we set up. We invested in SANS certifications. I'm not promoting SANS above anybody else, but at the time they were the performative group that seemed to be offering good certifications, sound technical certifications and training. The multi-state ISAC provided a once-a-year partnership with SANS where we were able to purchase certificates, training certificates. So we took a portion of our budget and we put it in that investment, and staff could apply for a training certificate. Their requirement was that they needed to complete the training and take the certification exam. Right? We wanted them to be successful. We had to allow room for that on work time. And I pause for emphasis there, because in what world do we expect people to go get the education they need?
Yeah,
to the
it's
job
not.
It's
not trivial. Like, some people are so
right.
busy during the day-to-day, unless you allocate.
Exactly. So you have to plan for success, and rather than ensure their failure by overwhelming them with more work. So we had to accommodate that within the structure of their work time, their work day, and so on. In addition to that, we also invested in allowing some of our staff to go back to school, to do master's degree programs or further education that helped support cyber functions that they were trying to either perform and or move into, right? Often you can offboard somebody that's internal into a cyber function. They may have been performing an operational IT function, and you can train them, or maybe they were in the legal unit or even in finances or whatever, but they have a propensity for the work that is involved in the cyber sector. And so you can reposition them, but you have to give them the training. I think the importance of investing in your people, and unfortunately, to your point, David, too many organizations make the mistake of not doing it, of thinking perhaps that cyber skills and knowledge does not require continuous nurturing and attention. Just because a person has a network background, right? I've worked in network infrastructure for 20 years. Doesn't mean you know how to secure a hybrid infrastructure with cloud properties. Just because you are a developer, and I don't care if you're the best coder in the world, doesn't mean you know how to securely code or test your applications for vulnerabilities. So I think there's cross training there. There's specific training within the swim lane that you're playing in. You also have to invest in training for people to move from an ad hoc culture, where they're running for the fire hoses every time there's a problem, to a more mature strategic approach to cybersecurity. And some of that is formal or maybe even informal training of educating your leadership in ways that help them understand the operational impact of a cybersecurity disruption on business. Recruiting talent, to your point, to get back to your point, recruiting talent, I think, needs to come from several places. We had a robust internship program. So being that I was an instructor in a university, I was able to handpick the goodness there. But we also had fellowships that were funded at a reasonable salary rate. I think the appeal of government work is that it's work worth doing that makes a difference in human beings' lives on a day-to-day basis. And I think if you can put it in that context, it's an attractive first job and or a career. So I didn't care whether you stayed with us for 2 years. Too many employers care about, long-term retention, or whether you came over, did an internship, and then went on to Ernst Young and PricewaterhouseCoopers. And many of them did and came back because of the culture of government services and the work environment and the ability to really feel like you were making a difference versus buried in a larger organization. So I think you need to sell, market, if you will, the opportunities that government provides. And you need to get people excited about that work, and then figure out what your funnels are, whether it's veterans that you're trying to court into service at the government service level after they come out of the service, or whether it's coming into the schools at high school level and talking about technical training and skills that they could get, or approaching women's groups, right, to get more women. I was one of, by the way, 4 female CISOs in the nation at the time that I served, and now I think there's only 2 or 3, which I think we've gone backwards a little bit. But tightening that up, looking for people who had the right mindset and skill set to develop a proper cyber education, and then seeding into that. So I know I covered a lot in a few minutes. I was trying to figure out all the other things that we did. Oh, giving people that are already working for you career opportunities, career paths, right? So they see themselves staying and continuing, and they aren't courted off to, someplace else, is also important. And then being flexible in terms of your workspace and workplace. We didn't suffer a lot in New York when COVID hit, even though I had already just before it hit, had retired and gone into private sector work. We didn't suffer a lot as a state because we had already entertained and engaged in remote access. So when that time came that people had to work from home, they already had that access, particularly in the IT and cyber realms, because we needed to work 24/7. And that often meant 2 a.m. getting a call. So you've got to think about those things, right? What matters? And talk to your people. What matters to them? Is it time off? Is it, the availability to their families? What's the work-life balance look like? And then try to do your best to meet their needs. Be flexible.
I love that, Deb, and I hope that people are listening to this podcast and potentially should consider, looking into the government space. I think that we don't do it justice. I think there's a lot of things have changed in the past, 10, 15 years from a lot of different areas, including technology, but also the work culture, the innovation, as you mentioned, the support and the investment in the employees as well, which again, I think that just the majority of us, think about a government position as something that's, at least in the mindset of some people, is archaic, and things are very, very different now than they used to be. And just listening to you, just to being passionate about what has been done so far, it's that by itself should trigger people to look into it. So
government is doing some amazing, at all levels, state, local. I work, one of the roles that I currently play is I'm a senior fellow for the Center for Digital Government. And in that capacity, I'm talking on a daily basis with state, local, and national government leaders. And it just constantly amazes me, the innovative approaches that are being taken to solve the grand challenges that government is faced with, whether it's pulling together data from disparate sources, or supporting field work, or just using data in ways that drive decision and policy to better government services for our citizenry. It's a fun space to work in. I've never regretted going into government, and I would firmly encourage people to consider it as a career opportunity. There's a place for you in government.
Absolutely. And I think if you look around and maybe look online, and just people always complain, they complain about the government not doing enough, but all you have to do is look around you and things are just working. It's remarkable that this massive endeavor, and we go out to our daily lives and things just work. We have a wonderful infrastructure that just works.
Right.
Financial
behind the scenes, right?
Yeah, behind the scenes, it just works.
Behind the scenes machine, and I think COVID, right? If I can reference COVID in a positive way, the silver lining was it was the most innovative and aggressive chief technology officer out there, right? We had to really figure out how to get the job of delivering government services done on the fly, under duress, and to solve problems that no one had ever thought through before, I think. And technology rose to the occasion, and I think proved their value 100%. And at the same time, we had to do it securely and with an idea of public expectations. So I think that coming off of that global pandemic, I think that expectation isn't going to fade.
And then you just don't get the quotas afterwards. That's the problem as a security professional. If nothing happens, you basically means that you're doing your job, but then yet there's no. It's very unrewarding in a sense that you're just behind the scene making sure that everything kind of works.
It's interesting you should say that. So I'm going to argue a little bit on
go
the
ahead.
side of being proactive, right? So maybe I have a little bit of marketing and perhaps some of the advertising bit in me. But one of the things that we did at the state that I found particularly successful was we had an annual report. So first we started by letting every team understand their connection to the work we were doing and their importance, the importance of their function. And of course, we measured every function to make sure that, there were no areas where we were deficient in terms of what we were hoping to achieve. So we were very outcome focused. And then we reported that, right? We celebrated. So we actually had a book of business that at the end of the year, we had an annual report. It had a letter on the front cover that was from yours truly, right? The state of cybersecurity. And we talked about some of the great things we'd done, how we'd moved the needle, and what we needed to do next, right? What the next chapter looked like. And then there was a page in that book, if you will, was a little 20-page nice little glossy package that you might see from a private sector entity that spoke to the value that each section or function sector of our team was bringing to the organizations that we served. And as our team would go out, as our business ISOs would go out and speak to commissioners or heads of agencies, they'd have that tucked right under their arm, and they'd give them a copy and talk about the value, right? The value proposition. Because let's face it, if you view cybersecurity as a business differentiator, as something that sets you above and apart from others performing the same function, that's where the traction occurs. And if you can talk about business value and talk about that proposition to the leaders of the organization, they're very quick to get on board and be your best champion, your best advocate. So those were some of the things we did to kind of make that case, if you will.
Absolutely incredible, Deb. Thank you very much. It's been really riveting conversation, and I personally learned a lot. Hopefully, the people that are listening to this conversation did too. We are running out of time. I feel like we're just kind of scratching the surface. Maybe we should do this again. Maybe pick a couple other topics. But Deb, what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you for whatever the reason is? Maybe just learn more about what you're doing in your teachings, maybe mentorship, just insight, whatever the case may be.
So LinkedIn is usually a first entry point, so you can find me rather easily there. Also, as I said, I teach at the State University of New York, University of Albany School of Business. So I'm easily reachable there. I'm on the faculty expert page and the adjunct instructor page. And if you Google my name, you'll find me there. And last but not least, if you're a vendor partner and you are interested in working with us through the Center for Digital Government, or if you're a state and local entity who needs advice from a government perspective, that is also a venue that you can pursue.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much for taking the time. And again, it's been a real pleasure. And for those who joined, thank you very much for joining today. Thanks for listening in, and looking forward to seeing you in the next episode. And until then, stay safe online as well as offline. I'll see you the next time.